With nearly universal agreement, the Afghanistan withdrawal was handled horribly wrong, and we just remembered 9/11. But something is missing from the discussion. In this episode, I expose the most strict form of Islam, which is a source motivation of the type of terrorism we experienced on 9/11, and how it will happen again if we don't attend to it. Hey, welcome back to the Farah Show. Today I want to explore source motives related to a certain type of terrorism. First, there's a reason that Americans are upset about the turn of events in Afghanistan. The problem is pretty straightforward. We lost, big time. And regardless of your foreign policy ideology, the debacle wasn't necessary. So that's embarrassing. There's a type of group called the Salafi Jihadi group, and the way they achieve their goals is with a core belief that violent holy war must be waged to restore Islam to its purest form. Now, others call them radical militant Islamists or Islamic terrorists. In terms of worldwide terrorist potential, the Salafi Jihadi groups, which include Al-Qaeda, has not been destroyed. They're still recruiting and they still have training camps. According to the United States State Department's reports on terrorism, Salafi Jihadi groups are strengthening in West, Central, and East Africa, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Now, we just left Afghanistan and cut a deal with the Taliban. You know, there's really not that much of a distinction between Taliban and a Salafi Jihadi group like Al-Qaeda. When Afghan warriors worked with U.S. support and they captured a Taliban guy, they found that he was in fact previously an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS guy. It's like jumping from company to company for them with some of these guys. Now, we've got some great counterterrorism measures that have limited the types of attacks against the United States in recent times. Yet the bad guys are thinking about it all the time. In 2019, ISIS instigated the Pensacola shooting. In 2020, the Shabab militants killed 3 Americans at a military base in Kenya, killed a CIA officer. And also in 2020, ISIS killed a couple of Marines. And just a few weeks ago, the Islamic State Khorasan province, or ISIS-K, conducted a suicide attack, killing 13 Americans and about 170 Afghan civilians in Kabul, Afghanistan. Now, for the United States to sell the end of involvement in Afghanistan, the pitch was to try to separate the Taliban from Al-Qaeda. But the Taliban won't renounce Al-Qaeda. And from our past initiatives, dead Taliban are found side by side with Al-Qaeda. And they're treated in the same hospitals in Pakistan. They also marry into each other's homes. Yet the current U.S. administration holds the mistaken belief that these Salafi Jihadi groups can be contained through negotiations. Most of us don't want to think in terms of foreign policy, and that makes sense. I mean, as long as bad things are happening far away, we would really like to just move on with our lives and not think about it. But that might be part of the problem. We just abandoned a first-class military airbase and all the resources that come with it, and we left terrorists in charge of it. For example, a guy by the name of Khalil Haqqani, a man with a $5 million bounty on his head offered by the FBI, is in charge of security. Haqqani is considered the leader of the most brutal and violent group associated with the Taliban. This can't be more crazy. I mean, we have diplomatic relations now with someone who's on the FBI's most wanted global terrorist list. Mohammed Akhund, or Akhund, however you pronounce it, was the deputy prime minister during Taliban's 1996 to 2001 rule of terror. And he's now the acting prime minister. So we just recalled 9/11, and I am really grateful for the plethora of platforms to remember our brave firefighters, our police officers, and all the others who died on that day. But it seems to me that sometimes there's a dearth of information on what would motivate this kind of terror. What is really at the heart of the individual who carries out a suicide bombing? Why are they okay with enslaving women, beheading Christians, and torturing political challengers? In Afghanistan, right after the withdrawal, the Taliban released a documentary transmitted to the whole nation. They now call themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, or a territory ruled by an Islamic ruler, is what that means. The documentary reveals how the little guy beat the big guy. They say 9/11 was America's fault. They celebrated 9/11 as a good thing. It was good to put America in its place, they say. And now with the withdrawal and leaving $85 billion of munitions and hundreds of Americans behind, the Taliban is proclaiming that the most powerful superpower of all time has lost to a small band of dedicated Islamic militants. So with our departure, we've moved headlong into disengagement. This is a strategy that had resulted in 9/11. And we're going to repeat all those mistakes that come from sloppy disengagement if we don't educate our young people on the source issue. I mean, from 1996 to 2001, Al-Qaeda was able to plan and orchestrate the 9/11 attacks from the safe harbor provided by the Taliban there in Afghanistan. Now, after they attacked us, we did bomb them to smithereens. But we got distracted with Iraq and neglected to seal the border into Pakistan. So it took us a decade instead of 2 months to capture and kill Osama bin Laden. So today I just want to look at something that's, I think, very dangerous. The long-term impact of teaching our children a whitewashed perspective of the motivation behind terrorism. Without a clear view, young minds will repeat mistakes when they become adults, and they'll go wanting for a rational understanding of the world. In fact, careful to avoid sounding Islamophobic, most public schools revise what actually happened on 9/11. Since 9/11, most schools avoid using the words attack, Islamic extremist, or holy war. When 9/11 rolls around, most schools never use the word jihad. My point here is not to create unnecessary fear or angst against a peaceful Muslim. We're happy to be a neighbor with that family. The point is to face reality and accurately explain what happened on 9/11 and expose the expressed motive. So as a refresher course, 2 landmark skyscrapers in Manhattan were destroyed by suicide pilots. The first plane was hijacked by a team of 5. It was an American Airlines flight flown into the North Tower. The second plane was also hijacked by a team of 5. It was a United flight flown into the South Tower minutes later. The third flight was another team of 5 and another American flight. It was hijacked and flown into the west side of the Pentagon. The fourth flight was a team of 4, since that 20th terrorist was detained in Dubai under suspicion. This flight could have crashed into the Capitol building, but it was diverted by some heroic passengers, and it crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. All 4 planes were early in their flight, which meant that they still had a whole bunch of fuel on board. So all the passengers who were not already killed by the knife were blown up upon the crash. Now, it took some time for Osama to sneak out over to Pakistan, get out of harm's way. But in 2004, Osama bin Laden formally claimed credit for 9/11. And years after that, we finally got Osama. The result of 9/11 was 2,977 fatalities and 25,000 injuries. You know, it's still the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. We lost 340 courageous firefighters and 72 police officers. These facts must be shared with 8th grade students. You know, we've got memorials in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania to make sure that we don't forget what happened. But if you're a student in a public school, you'd never know it. Progressive liberal leftist educators provide our 13-year-olds with an opaque understanding, and no motive is discussed. That's dangerous. When our young people do not understand source motivations that surround an event like 9/11, they develop an unrealistic view of the world, and it ultimately results in failed foreign policy. Now, motives are generally a hard thing to uncover in a whole bunch of instances, but here, they're clear. Here's an example. The strategic leader, Osama bin Laden, published and signed his declaration of holy war in 1996, and then another one in 1998. The 1996 version is titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Mosques. We had relationships with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and so they say we're occupying them. It's a long letter, but in it, Osama boasts about a 1983 Beirut bombing where 241 Marines were murdered. The language is largely directed at the U.S. Here's a few quotes to give you an idea. He's speaking of his own warriors. These youths believe in what has been told by Allah and his messenger about the greatness of the reward for the Mujahideen martyrs. Those youths know that their reward in fighting you, the USA, is double their reward in fighting someone else. They have no intention except to enter paradise by killing you. Those youths will not ask you for explanations. They will not tell you. There's nothing between us that needs to be explained. There's only killing and neck smiting. Those youths are different from your soldiers. Your problem will be how to convince your troops to fight, while our problem will be how to restrain our youths to wait for their turn in fighting. That was his 1996 version. His 1998 version was signed by Osama and then 4 other leaders from self-described jihad movements. The title was Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. Crusaders are Christians. They conveyed that they had a responsibility to, and I'm quoting again, kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, which is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it's possible to do it. End of quote. And there's a whole bunch more on Osama describing his motive, but it's pretty explicit. You get the idea. The motive of the head of the Al-Qaeda is clear. Now, let's fast forward to September 2001. There were 19 terrorists who carried out the attack. Osama bin Laden was the strategic leader, but the leader on the ground supervising the 18 terrorists in addition to himself that carried out the 9/11 attack was an Islamic radical named Mohammed Atta. He was an Egyptian, recruited by Osama for the Plains operation. In late 1999, Atta met Osama in Kandahar, over in Afghanistan, Osama's favorite city over there. Here, he and the 3 others on the team agreed to pledge loyalty to the suicide mission. They get in a circle, they go through a chant, and they recite some things, and they pledge their loyalty. All 4 of them had good English skills, and they could get visas to the United States. So Atta and his team moved with his co-terrorists, and he got his pilot license in November of 2000. By the time September 11th rolls around, a little less than a year after he gets his pilot license, he was on the first flight. He boarded American Airlines Flight 11 on September 11th. He took control of the plane and he crashed it into the North Tower. From that one flight, over 1,600 people died. But why? What's the point? You know, the Christian idea promulgates life. Suicide is actually considered a sin. What could cause a talented guy like Atta to be willing to be so proactive about his suicide? He started years earlier. Now, his dad was an attorney in Egypt. Both of his sisters are professionals and successful. He made good grades in undergraduate school, studying to be an architect. In his 20s, he became more and more reclusive and hardened toward the most strict form of Islam. In his early 30s, his relationship with the other 3 pilots escalated, they were in Germany together, into thinking through specific ways to attack America. And then he commits suicide at the age of 33. But you know, he could have enjoyed a good life. He was smart enough to get his pilot's license. He even got a commercial license. He could have become a commercial pilot and pursued a career in flying or in architecture. But that wasn't his motive, to do something productive that adds value. No, between his flying lessons, he went on several commercial surveillance flights to get details on how to make the attack work, how to execute the 9/11 plan. He used his brain power to think through how to attack the pilots and secure the door, how to kill the stewardesses that were closest to the door, how the muscle would keep the cockpit door closed and protected while he was crashing the plane into the tower. In July, before that fateful September 9/11 attack, he went over to Spain to meet with his other leaders to finalize the plan. The suicide muscle had already been hired, and they were going to come in and kill the pilots and some of the stewardesses and anyone else who would get in the way. The logistics capability alone that Atta put together showed that he could have been successful, doing good things. But he used his capabilities to plan a way to kill people in cold blood. And the part we have a hard time understanding is that he would do that and leave himself with no personal escape route. Why is that? Well, the night before the attack is revealing. On September 10th, he provided all 18 murderers, in addition to himself, with a detailed plan. How do you keep that many people focused on killing themselves and not backing out? The 19 suicide terrorists were provided with 15 exhortations. How do we know this? Well, amazingly, his luggage didn't make it onto the American Airlines flight because of a delay in the flight. So his bags didn't get blown up. When they were discovered and recovered by the FBI, they found there were airline uniforms, flight manuals, and his instructions called The Last Night. These instructions were actually divided into 3 sections. He called them phases. The FBI released that to the public. The last 2 phases are instructions for traveling to the plane and what to do between the time you board and kill everyone and yourself. Or as he described it, entering blissful martyrdom. But we're just going to look at that first phase. And in it, there are 15 things. It's a 15-point list of the last night of a martyr's life. So things that he wants them to think about before they go into eternal bliss and martyrdom. So as we go through these in a very abbreviated form, I believe you will be able to uncover for yourself the motive. First, renew your vow to die. Second, review the suicide plan. I mean, these first 2 say a lot. I mean, for us, life is sacred. It's the first freedom right. I mean, the right to life. And if government has any role at all, it must protect innocent life. Yet they see death as the ticket to peace. Okay, let's move to number 3. Third, read the 2 war chapters from the Quran. These chapters are also instructive. You know, I'd actually never read a full chapter in the Quran until this research project. So here's a quick summary. The 8th chapter of the Quran is called Al-Anfa, or the Spoils. It contains 75 verses. The tone is decidedly toward severe punishment and suffering in the torment of fire for any unbeliever. Allah hates them, so you Islamic warriors should fight ferociously and, quote unquote, never turn your back. In other words, at the foundation is this angry God. So even though the warrior may have struck the blow, we find in verse 17, quote, he did not kill them, but it was Allah who killed them, unquote. You're not guilty of murder. You're expelling infidels on behalf of Allah. So even angels are mean in this chapter. I mean, verse 51 says, angels take the souls of the disbelievers, beating their faces and backs, saying, taste the torment of burning, unquote. So if you're wondering why the Taliban can be so brutal, you might look at what they believe. Allah is always ready to exact severe punishment. So what are you to do if you're a soldier in the Islamic army and you come upon a person who does not believe in Allah? Well, verse 57 says, if you ever encounter them in battle, and I'm quoting, make fearsome example of them. Some interpret that to mean beheadings and other extreme punishment. When you keep on reading, get up to verse 67, that could be interpreted to justify slaughter until the land is totally subdued. That's that chapter. The next one, the 9th chapter of the Quran, has 129 verses, and it's called the Al-Tawbah, or the Repentance. To the Islamic militant, it authorizes slaughtering idolaters and polytheists. Now, an idolater is basically a Jew, since he worships the God of the Old Testament versus Allah. And a Christian is a polytheist, since the God of the Bible includes one God in 3 distinct forms: God the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. They are to be given, quote unquote, a painful punishment. Now, after they take everyone over, the prisoners that haven't been slaughtered yet, if you're just ignorant and may be willing to convert to Islam, you will be spared, but only for 4 months. You've got to decide. If after 4 months you don't convert, verse 5 says to kill the polytheists wherever you find them and capture them and besiege them and sit in wait for them at every place of ambush, unquote. In the event you find unbelievers in your midst, verse 14 says, fight them. Verse 15 says that by fighting the infidel, you will remove rage from your heart. In other words, the path to peace, besides dying for the cause, is to kill an infidel. It goes on to describe a harsh penalty for lack of strict obedience. There's just really no concept of this peaceful coexistence with various renditions of belief going on here. In verse 29, the Quran says, fight against those who do not believe in Allah. And verse 30 to 32 explicitly opposes Jews and Christians. The adherent is to fight the polytheists or be punished himself. And you must remain fiercely loyal, because verse 39 says, quote unquote, quoting here, if you do not march forth, Allah will afflict you with a painful torment and replace you with other people. So what's a young adherent to do? In verse 52, there's only two possible outcomes for a true believer. Either victory when you kill and slaughter the Jews and the Christians, or martyrdom by dying for the cause. And verses 88 and 90 promise that those who fight to the death will get a great reward. Now, this has been studied, and a lot of the battles have been studied since. And according to the Council on Foreign Relations, these chapters of the Quran were used to justify a lot of the violence over the centuries, including the genocide of the Iraqi Kurds in 1986 to 1989, and the 9/11 attack against the United States in 2001. These chapters support the concept of jihad, or holy war. The group called Al-Qaeda carried out that 9/11 attack, believing they were complying with a holy war. Now, most Muslims take a much more moderate view in practice, but Islamic extremists don't think they're terrorists. They believe they're the true believers, doing Allah's work and complying with their interpretation of these chapters in the Quran when they inflict terror, enslave women, and behead infidels, the people that don't believe the way they do. So, number 3 of the 15 exhortations that reveal motive is read Al-Tawbah and Anfal, and those 2 chapters, and reflect on their meanings and remember all of the things Allah has promised for the martyrs. That's the quote. Number 4 through 6 is a reminder to meditate on 100% obedience. Number 7 exhorts the terrorists to forget about life on earth. Number 8 reminds the terrorists to feel complete tranquility because the time between you and the marriage in heaven is very short. Number 9 reminds the terrorist that there is nothing he could do about the fate of tomorrow anyway. He's going to die in some other way anyway because Allah is going to take him out. But by going through with it, all your sins will be erased. Number 10 exhorts the terrorist into following through and attributes manipulative language to Allah. Here's what they say Allah says in that note. Did you think you could go to heaven before God knows whom amongst you have fought for him? If Allah gives you victory, no one can beat you. And if he betrays you, who can give you victory without him? In the Christian faith, God's faithful even when we aren't. Now let's look at number 11. Number 11 speaks to remembering all the supplications that you've received. Number 12 instructs a ritual to read a verse into the hands and rub the hands over all the weapons of war. What are your weapons of war? Your luggage, your knife, and your ID. Number 13 elevates the murder. It's merciful. It's not even really killing a human. It instructs the terrorist to make sure your knife is very sharp so that when you kill her, and I'm quoting, it does not discomfort your animal during the slaughter. Number 14 is an instruction to tighten your clothes. That kind of dates back to the 8th century when a soldier prepared for battle. Finally, number 15 is to pray the morning prayer to reflect on how great the reward will be in just a few short hours. This is their expressed motivation. It's what they thought about the night before. It should be understood to assist peace-loving policymakers to make meaningful, clear-minded decisions in a really dangerous world. You know, Osama bin Laden had another quote from that declaration of war document way back in 1996. It shows how much we're observed. Let me just give you the full quote. And he's accusing us of being wimps. Your most disgraceful case was in Somalia, where you moved an international force, including 28,000 American soldiers. However, when tens of your soldiers were killed in minor battles and one American pilot was dragged into the streets of Mogadishu, you left the area carrying disappointment, humiliation, defeat, and your dad with you. Clinton appeared in front of the whole world, threatening and promising revenge, but these threats were merely a preparation for your withdrawal. You have been disgraced by Allah, and you withdrew. The extent of your impotence and weakness became very clear. So Osama goes on to explain that he represents the true Sharia law, the true Islamic idea, and that's where he's coming from. There is a different approach, and it's derived from the classical Christian thought. Even people who aren't Christians have borrowed from this to come up with war strategy. The mindset limits itself to a just war. It isn't to suggest that Christians are always good at implementing that mindset, because we've been horrible at it in many instances. We've made very bad decisions and gotten into wars for the wrong reasons. But the framework of the decision model, the goal, is supposed to go like this. War is bad. Peace is almost always better. We should avoid war unless it's the only way for peace to prevail. Now, the Crusaders, who called themselves Christians but weren't really heartfelt believers, were way off base. You never go to war to compel your religious beliefs. Not so. Besides, the Christian faith is a voluntary belief in the person who introduces himself as the Prince of Peace. So how do you pull off this Christian idea of determining if a war is just? Well, first there has to be some compelling reason. It has to be like national defense or like fighting for a freedom right. And then second, this decision must be made by those in authority at the government level. You can't have a band or a gang of militants. Third, it has to be clear that the actions of the enemy are awful and they're morally wrong. Fourth, it has to be for the purpose of protecting justice and ensuring safety, never to pillage, conquer, gain territory, or destroy. Fifth, all the diplomatic approaches to peace must be tried first. Sixth, there needs to be a high probability of success, which includes minimum harm to civilians. And seventh, the positive results of the war need to outweigh the loss of life and injury that's going to be caused here at home. And finally, when it seems there's no other option, you've got to equip your military to win. We didn't do that last one in Afghanistan. As you can see, there's a distinct difference between what Osama proclaimed and what's largely embraced in some form or another by the Western world. So, how should we train our young people to face reality? Well, first, let's just look at what Maureen Malarkey says. She's an artist and she writes on art and culture. And she wrote this article September 9th on her lament of this anti-American education system. She describes how there was this exhibit at the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. So 9/11/11. And this was put on by 13-year-olds. And they were going to exhibit how they described 9/11, what they learned about 9/11, what they knew about it. Now, they were just little toddlers when actual 9/11 hit. So what did the 8th graders display? Well, one quarter of them said that America was just another rogue state. There were no references to Al-Qaeda or the enemy assault. Instead, cartoon Marines head to Afghanistan. Bombs drop on Afghanistan. A soldier lectures on bad Arabs. Americans start using the flag as a symbol of war. No displays showed any mention of jihad or explaining what a holy war was. There was no evil abroad. All the displays only saw evil at home. We had burned mosques and dehumanized Muslims. So none of the New Yorkers who had died or their families were victims, just Muslims. Now, how did they describe the collapse of the Twin Towers? Well, without facing reality. They made it seem like it was just a natural disaster. They just talked about smoke in an opaque way. There was no revelation of what caused it, not a single hint that it came from burning skyscrapers where nearly 3,000 civilians were slaughtered. The kids made no mention of the Quran-inspired commercial jets that were hijacked. What was the instrument of this mass murder? No mention. So now those youngsters are 23. They have graduated from college, they've entered professions, they've begun their corporate careers, and they've become voters. Teaching our kids blatant distortion of the past is dangerous, and it blinds you to clear thinking, and it blinds you and it prevents you really from being a real grown-up. America cannot responsibly run away from its role in the world without having consequences. Biden seems to be guided by those same teachers. I mean, he withdrew with the highest casualty rate in Afghanistan in over a decade. And he's unrepentant. I mean, he boasts about how fantastic the withdrawal was. But the Taliban now control more territory and more munitions and more technology than they did 20 years ago. And the Taliban has never rebuked or rejected Al-Qaeda. I mean, they were given another chance just a few weeks ago to do so, and they passed. And now we're supposed to give these terrorists diplomatic recognition? I mean, back in 1842, there were 16,000 Brits who had marched out of Afghanistan. They had previously tried to take over and occupy Afghanistan. Only one of those 16,000 survived, and that's because the Afghans wanted them to live to tell the story. So if you're wondering why the Brits showed more courage and had their special ops troops go out into the streets of Kabul and escort their citizens to the airport, well, now you know. They faced reality. Well, we ignored it. The Taliban used 70-year-old weapons. They live in an 8th century mindset, and they just defeated the world's most impressive superpower. When we cut and run, we send a clear message. The American idea is not worth fighting for because we're too weak, too political, and too woke, and we don't believe in freedom enough to fight for it. Just in the past 3 weeks, we have proof of women being stoned to death, government employees executed, girls' schools being bombed, and comedians being hanged brutally. The message is that we don't keep our word. American diplomats and soldiers promised Afghans that if they worked with us, we'd be with them essentially forever. The only hope is to teach our children the truth. And hopefully from there, they can make wise and sensible decisions. To your freedom, and God bless you.
Hi, I'm David Farah. Thank you for listening to my dad's podcast, The Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. Click subscribe now to be sure you don't miss an episode. Share this podcast with your friends on social media and give The Barry Farah Show your 5-star rating. Check out today's show notes below this episode and at thebarryfarahshow.com. This podcast is also available in video format at The Barry Farah Show on YouTube. See you next time.